You got water in it.
Yeah,
Nice.
it really is like a TV show or something like that.
Hi. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Jubilee Centre. My name is Mims.
And my name is Ruben, and we want to share a bit about the Jubilee project and what it is about.
So here's a little copy. If you would like this in print form, please do get in touch and we'll send you this in the post. But yeah, we thought we'd just also introduce ourselves as well and allow you guys in and allow you the opportunity to get to know us as well. So Ruben, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a Venezuelan. I live in Bristol and I studied political science and public policy in the US and Israel. I worked for YWAM for 7 years in communications. I did many outreaches, but I always had a heart for public policy and government. Uh, yeah, and I've been working for the Jubilee Center for the last 3 years. So you probably received a few newsletters from me, the archives, the blogs, the articles. I sort of organize all of this behind the scene. And you probably attended a few of the webinars that I developed. In a couple of years ago, we decided we wanted to get younger people more engaged with our archives and our relational values. So we decided to get some younger people to write with us some blogs, and now we want to get on that as well. And now our team is growing. We have Mims with us. And yeah, now I'm the director of operations, making sure things run smoothly behind the scene.
Thanks.
What about you? Tell me a bit about you.
So yeah, my name is Mims. A bit about me. So I actually grew up in South Africa, and I moved over to the UK in 2018. That was for a gap year, and in that gap year, I had the real privilege and joy of working with my grandfather, Michael Schluter, and he founded multiple charities, and I got to work for him with the relational peace building initiatives, which was really fun, and I got to travel loads. So yeah, I then went on to do a degree. So I did a degree at Durham in joint honours of anthropology and sociology. That then led me to do the care leadership programme. So I moved down to London and started working for a member of parliament, which then led me to leading as the secretary for the APPG on dying well. I also ended up working for a Lord Spiritual, and so it was just such a fun and formative time in Parliament over those sort of 2.5 years. And then after that, I moved to LICC, where I worked in their culture and discipleship space before moving to the Jubilee Centre to take on this current role as their Director of Development. So we've been doing loads of fun things over the last few months. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
It's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, if for anyone who hasn't really known the work of the Jubilee Center, what are we about? Why were we sort of created?
Yeah. So the Jubilee Centre was founded in 1983 in Cambridge by my grandfather. He and a couple of his colleagues were trying to figure out what the alternatives were to kind of capitalism, socialism, and sort of the moving agendas or isms of the day. And what did it mean to engage the Bible and allow scripture to lead how we engage in all of life? And what is our ultimate pursuit? What is our ultimate goal? And they landed in the passage in Matthew 22:39, love the Lord your God, love your neighbour as yourself. And that was sort of it. The main goal, the main aim, and the kind of prime commandment from Jesus at that stage is love. And so what is love? And love is a quality of relationship. And so one of the questions they then had was sort of, okay, well, if love's a quality of relationship, how do we manage our relationships? How do we make sure that relationships are honoured and stewarded well? How do we love other people well? And the second sort of, or hang on, verse to that Matthew 22:39 verse is on these two things, hang the law and the prophets. And so it's an immediate picture to look right back to the law and the prophets for that kind of I suppose, like pivotal guidance as to how we are to organize ourselves societally. Obviously, that included then a comprehensive study of the Bible and sort of detailed analysis of law in Old Testament. And I think the centre really identified then that centrality of right relationships as sort of the touchstone of a Christian vision for healthy nations and healthy communities. I mean, I think outside of all of that as well, we believe that God created us. We believe that God created in his image. He knows how we function best. And so when we look back to those laws given to Israelites in the Old Testament, which in part are kind of culturally and time specific, they do contain principles of how human society, how we work best, which can then be extracted and applied. So the centre was basically set up with that as its original kind of conviction and mission, and it's done that through a series of ways, through education, through research, through sort of talks and conferences. So yeah, that's sort of how it all started, I suppose. And having had a kind of dip in recent years, the centre has decided to revisit its original conviction and mission. So yeah.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned relationships. Now, why does the center care so much about relationships?
Yeah, so I think thinking back to that sort of that passage in Matthew about love and love being a quality of relationship, it's also just how we were created. So, I mean, Jesus is affirming that in Matthew, but it's what we see all throughout the Old Testament. Even with creation, God created us for a relationship with him, and then he also created man to be in relationship with one another. So there's relationship horizontally and relationship vertically, and those are kind of prime to who we are and how we're created. We can also see that God is intrinsically relational, so 3 in 1, Father, Spirit, Son. And we also just see that God models this through Jesus, and we can read about that in the scriptures. He's relational both in what he says and what he does, and so the core of his ministry is fixing relationships. So yeah, that's why we care so much about
powerful calling, relationships. And now that we're thinking of this new season, this new strategy for the Jubilee Center, now why should we look at the Jubilee Manifesto that was done 20 years ago and sort of start from scratch there?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the Jubilee Manifesto is a publication that the Jubilee Centre put out about, I think it was about 20 years ago, 2005. And this is sort of like the linchpin of our work going forward. And one of the reasons we've done that is because the Jubilee Manifesto continues to sort of hold and shape the credible wisdom and this sort of thoughtful, paradigmatic approach that the Jubilee Centre has sort of honed over many years to public theology. And so re-engaging it as sort of the linchpin sort of helps us as we navigate kind of why we're here, what we're doing, what are those kind of original frameworks that were created and sort of distilled by sort of the original group of sort of thought leaders who worked with the Jubilee Centre. And so in 2005, this group sort of undertook that task of trying to articulate the biblical basis for social reform, and sort of in alignment with the vision of the centre, they were guided by the conviction that Scripture has that final authority on matters of like faith and conduct. And so their work really extended to questions of public policy, and you see that in the agenda section of the book. So you've got framework and then you've got agenda. And within the agenda, they sort of did quite timely responses as to how Scripture might therefore shape public policy. And the final chapter of their book talks about strategy. And so this kind of thesis in this book argued for the centrality of relationships in public policy decisions. And they really faithfully articulated, I think, biblical revelation, which provided examples and perspectives on how one might engage these issues of social, economic, and political matters through this relational lens. And so it was a real pivotal publication, sort of encapsulating a lot of what the Jubilee Centre was doing and why it was doing it and how it was doing it. So we just thought this was a really good resource to sort of reinvest in as we look to re-equip the next generation and refresh the Jubilee Centre.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good manifesto. I remember reading it a couple of years ago, and there were sort of many aha moments. It's like, oh, this makes so much sense. How can we apply this into so many different areas of our lives? Because it's not just for our religious life, it's also for a day-to-day life. So looking at that and how it's presented, why is it good to have it as an invitation to dialogue rather than just a final word?
Absolutely. So when that group proposed those principles that kind of applied biblical ideas to public life, their desire in writing it was not necessarily to just present their observations of scripture as like sacrosanct. Instead, their aim was to invite people into that process of dialogue and engagement to sort of equip Christian disciples to communicate and apply the Bible more effectively, but also to strengthen, I think, their apologetics. So, the book in and of itself says that it's the end of the beginning. And I think that really sort of reflects the group's belief that their work marked kind of the start of a long-term field of research rather than necessarily being its conclusion. And what the Jubilee Manifesto as an invitation does is it really intentionally invites future generations to engage and to have a seat at the table, and it equips them with sort of directions to scripture and sort of overall frameworks of potential application. And so having something that's already there that invites people in, that gets people grappling with scripture as a sort of default is just such a gift. And so I think it was written in a way that really does invite people to continue having those conversations no matter which generation we sit in.
Yeah, a very valuable thing to consider. Now, how will this look in practice if we look at the Jubilee Manifesto?
Yeah, so over the next few years, which is our prayer, and through sort of intergenerational dialogue, as I sort of said, through those original thought leaders, so the original contributors of the Jubilee Manifesto, and then younger writers. So through that sort of partnership, the Jubilee Centre is hoping to basically adapt some of those original frameworks, agenda items, and then strategies of the 2005 publication to address some of the cultural issues that we're facing today. This will be done in a kind of multimedia way, so through blogs, essays, podcasts. We're looking at some proposed chapter addendums, adding some based on the kind of cultural moments. So we're seeking to, through this effort, basically redeploy some of these powerful relational frameworks in sort of reiterated and refreshed proposals. So that's what it'll look like.
Yeah, it seems like what is needed is a relational perspective on all of these issues. We see public policy, we see economics. Now, why is it important? Why do you think it's an important thing to consider as we're developing different way of thinking about the world and
Absolutely.
how we live? Yeah.
So I think one of the most powerful things, and we kind of said this earlier in our conversation, is that relational lens, that relational element. And we believe that sort of the Old Testament laws, they work. They work in the sense that we understand them to provide a perspective most true to the way that God designed us. And this relational lens, though, whilst based on a biblical understanding, doesn't necessarily need to be shared as such, so they can be applied without necessarily referring to them as Christian, which I think gives us a great opportunity to gain broader support from society, who kind of see that they work and they have value. So this was seen most notably, I think, in the Keep Sunday Special campaign, which was a campaign that the Jubilee Centre ran sort of in about 20 odd years ago. I might be wrong on that, which was based around the human need for a break, and that idea of having a day set aside in society such that families could be together, such that relationships are really invested in, rather than necessarily being let's set a Sunday aside for worship. That wasn't the main goal. We didn't need the Sunday set aside just for Christians to be able to have worship, but we needed the day set aside because intrinsically humans are relational, and that is one of the most important ways to the way that we are designed. And so having this Old Testament law that we can look back at and get perspectives as to how relationships can be the ultimate goal of how we organize society, can get broad support from a range of people. I think it's a very compelling and a very almost like rational way of viewing things, I suppose.
Yeah.
Maybe not rational, rational might be the wrong word, but convincing, compelling. It's a good default. When we're looking at public policy, when we're looking at debate around economics and politics, what needs to be our default? Our default should be how
point of reference, even.
Point of reference, yeah, absolutely. Like almost like our checkpoint. How does this honor and steward relationships? How does this make our relationships flourish? Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have to go too far if you look at the scriptures and seeing how God sort of designed for people to live together, to live in community, to care for one another. I think in every single piece of the law, in the commandments, the first 5, it just talks about how we relate to one another.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's quite amazing. I've been reading Leviticus lately, which is crazy. It's just like, let me just go in. Where it talks about how we should eat some birds and like some animals and some insects, and it's through a lot of observation. It's like, how do we live in connection, like to our environment, to the people. So I think if we can find any point of reference that can be applied today, we should go for it, because it was given by God, and I think He cares for us. He loves us. He wants us to have good qualities of life.
Absolutely. So, yeah.
Now, when it comes to the current demand for biblically rooted social thought, why is it important that we're just not just talking about single issue commentary on things?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to that default position that I was kind of talking about in the last question. What is your default? So I think across the globe, there have been sort of deepening political divides, contested debates around immigration, social policy. And I think sometimes as Christians, we can be on the front foot for a lot of these sort of single policy whack-a-mole issues, which often lean more into some of those moral questions. And I think when the day is done and the vote is finished, what do we default to? What is the kind of bigger framework, that bigger vision for society that we as Christians are acting from? And what is it that we default to? And so there's a real need for a coherent social vision over just sort of single issue symptoms of systematic sort of relational breakdown. And I think both churches and individuals, we're longing for just sort of that practical, theologically rooted resource that offers credible perspectives and wisdom on relationships, economics, local renewal, civic engagement. And we have that in the scriptures. And I think as Christians, I would love to see a movement of sort of the next cohort being really equipped with that coherent social vision, so that when we default from those, single issue policies that we are on the front foot of, we can also take stock of how some of those issues relate to some of the more unseen policies that we might not necessarily be campaigning for. It might be even things like debt cancellation, or the environment, or family, or law, or justice. It can be things even in how we do welfare. How do we structure our welfare system? How do we care for the poor? And I think some of these things, they really fit into and are so sort of coherently articulated through that social vision. And find that right in the Bible. And where's a better place to start?
I think it's a really good time to do it, because there's sort of a growth in interest in Christianity. And you've seen people like Justin Brearley talking in his book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Now, why is it important that we sort of take a hold of this time and this cultural revival as you consider the renewed work of the Jubilee Center?
So I think thinking about the UK, and I mean, I know that the official sort of research that was done by the Bible Society has been withdrawn, but I think the discussions on the bubblings of choir revival are still evident. I think when I think about my own church, there are many people who are coming into church either for the first time or returning to church after a long time away. And even for my in-laws who live in Essex, they've got young individuals sort of walking through the door without any prior knowledge of God. And I think this is part of the kind of broader thing that's going on culturally, where I think we're dealing with a bit of a kind of cultural meaning crisis. Like, where is my purpose? Who do
Mm,
I yeah, where do I sort of root myself? And I think politically there is sort of a much more divisive time. So often those options for where we might root ourselves politically are in the extremes. And I think that's really confusing for people and that's quite difficult. And there are also lots of things happening, like some of the secular thinkers are considering Christianity. So you've got Louise Perry, who recently became a Christian, and Tom Holland, who I think has been very sympathetic to the Christian faith, and a lot of his writing and kind of historical observations. And then we also think about just that underlying Christian historical and kind of cultural impact of the Christian faith. And we think about like The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scribner, and then again Tom Holland. And so I think with more people exploring and considering faith, I think it's really imperative and really important that people and communities and the church are equipped with a framework for engaging all of life and a worldview lens through which they can both sort of encourage these new believers and encourage believers of many years, I suppose, with sort of a lens through which they're able to live out and influence life faithfully. And I think there's a real need for, as new believers join the church and as the church grows and as the church engages with these divides and these questions of life, that we're able to do that defaulting to that whole that's like whole coherent worldview for life.
I think we mentioned a little bit about how we wanted to get younger people to engage with relational thinking and how they can apply this in different aspects of their lives and society. Now, what would it look like for the Jubilee Center in this new season?
Absolutely. So this new season, one of the things that we are really leaning into and we're really excited for is that we want this movement to be intergenerational. I think this is a really, really important combination. There's just so much pressure on Gen Z at the moment to both be the target audience and to be the creators of content. And I think there's a real threat, or there's a real danger of siloing generations and saying that was the generation of old, we will listen to and critique you, but actually we've got our own way now and we understand our own sort of generational climate better. And I think there's real wisdom to be learnt from both. I think both generations can really lean on one another. And with scripture as that unchanging truth and as that sort of real foundation for how we engage with some of these issues and topics, to have an intergenerational dialogue on these things can only, I think, give us more fruitful and enriched perspectives, especially when it comes to the kind of cultural context that we're coming from when we have those conversations. And so we really just want to model some of those promises made to Abraham, all the way back in Genesis, or when God first makes that promise. It's an intergenerational promise. And so we are wanting to model and embody and equip Christians for the intergenerational sort of effort that we as Christians have, and that we as Christians live.
This is a bit of our conversation on the project that we're developing that we want to start soon, and we want to invite you to join us at the Jubilee Center in this season of growth as we see polarization and broken communities become more and more evident in real time. And we want to encourage the church and those in the community to reflect on what values and principles we want to live by. Relationships are at the center at the Jubilee Center. And we are definitely encouraged by Matthew 22:37-40 to live that out.
And I mean, Matthew 22, I think just to end, I'd love to read that because I think it is similarly, scripture needs to be the foundation for all that we do, and it needs to be the default, the ultimate default for everything that we do. And so I might just close this conversation by reading that piece of scripture. But before I do that, if you want to be in touch, do email us. do get in touch. Do go to our website, have a look at some of the stuff that we've been doing. And if you would like to partner with us more intentionally, either through prayer or financially, for this Jubilee project and what it seeks to do in this next season, please do be in touch. And I would love to have a conversation with you, have a coffee, and chat through some of our plans going forward. But yeah, as we close, let me read Matthew 22, 37 to 14. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Thanks, guys, for tuning in.
Thank you,
Yeah, I
everyone.
hope to be in touch with you soon. Bye.
Bye bye.